She pressed a silk handkerchief to her nose the day she saw my muddy boots. This time it wasn't a handkerchief. It was laughter. Bright, careless, tossed over her shoulder like something she'd already forgotten. "That's the help, not family," she told her friends, and they laughed with her, glasses clinking, while I stayed on my knees under her parents' kitchen sink, wrench in hand, saying nothing at all. What she didn't know was that her father was about to walk through that door, and what he was about to say would change everything she thought she understood about the man she'd just humiliated. The drive out to the Whitfield house took 40 minutes from the shop, and I spent most of it with the windows cracked, letting the cold October air cut through the smell of grease and cut copper that never quite left my hands, no matter how many times I scrubbed them. I'd been at a job site since 6 that morning, a commercial retrofit out past the interstate, 3 floors of corroded pipe that nobody else wanted to touch. And I hadn't planned on stopping home to change before Ashley's parents' engagement dinner. I'd planned on it. Then a coupling failed on floor 2, and planning became something other people got to do. My name is David Calloway. I'm 52 years old, and I own a company that most people have never heard of, unless they work in plumbing supply, HVAC distribution, or commercial construction. Calloway Fabrication. Started in a rented garage bay with $11,000 and my father's toolbox 26 years ago. These days it supplies fittings and components to half the contractors between here and the state line. I don't say that to brag. I say it because it matters to what happened next, and because for most of my life nobody who looked at me ever guessed it. My father was a plumber for 31 years, the kind of man who could diagnose a failing system by the sound it made before he ever touched a wrench to it. He used to say the trade teaches you humility whether you want it or not, because pipes don't care what your bank account looks like. They fail the same way for everyone. I learned that lesson at his elbow before I learned to drive, and somewhere along the way, even after the company grew into something bigger than either of us ever expected, I never managed to unlearn it. I still carry his old wrench in my truck. Wood handle, worn smooth in the middle where 3 generations of hands have gripped it. I don't carry it out of sentiment exactly. I carry it because it reminds me who I actually am, underneath whatever the balance sheet says. Ashley didn't know any of that yet. Not really. We've been together 14 months, engaged for 6 weeks, and there was a version of her I loved fiercely. Funny, quick, unexpectedly tender at 3 in the morning when the world felt too big for her. And there was another version, one that surfaced at dinners like this one, around people whose approval she'd spent her whole life chasing. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself people grow. I believed that, mostly. The way you believe things you need to be true. I pulled up outside her parents' house at 5:40, 20 minutes before anyone else was expected. Still in my work boots, my flannel shirt streaked gray at the cuffs, my hands smelling like pipe dope and cold metal. I told myself I'd wash up in the guest bathroom before anyone arrived. I had no idea, walking up that driveway, that the sink inside was already broken, or that fixing it would be the thing that finally showed me exactly who I was about to marry. The front door was unlocked, the way it always was at the Whitfield house, a house that had never once, in the 14 months I'd known it, felt like it needed locking. Marion, the housekeeper, met me in the front hall with the dish towel over her shoulder and a look of mild relief on her face. The look of someone who has been alone with a problem for a while and is grateful to see anyone capable of solving it. "Mr. Calloway, thank goodness," she said. "You're early. Mrs. Whitfield's going to have a fit. The kitchen sink's been leaking since Tuesday, and the plumber they called can't come out till next month. Everything's booked this time of year." "Let me take a look," I said, before I'd even thought about it. It wasn't a decision so much as an instinct, the same one that had gotten me out from under warm covers at 2 a.m. more times than I could count when I was younger, driving out to some stranger's house because a pipe had burst and a family was standing in 6 inches of water. Some things don't leave you. They just wait for the next opportunity to be useful. Marion led me to the kitchen, a bright, expensive room with granite counters and a farmhouse sink that probably cost more than my first truck, water pooling steadily beneath the cabinet doors, a sour, damp smell already working its way into the grout. I set my keys on the counter, rolled my sleeves the rest of the way up, and went back out to my truck for my toolbox. The same steel box my father had given me the year I turned 22, dented on one corner, his initials still scratched faintly into the lid beneath 26 years of mine layered over it. By the time I was on my knees under the sink, headlamp clipped to my collar, wrench in hand, I'd found the problem inside 4 minutes. A corroded supply line fitting, the kind of thing that fails quietly for weeks before it finally gives. I heard the front door open somewhere behind me. Voices, laughter, the particular pitch of a group of young women arriving somewhere they intend to be seen. Ashley's voice rose above the others, bright and easy, the voice she used when she felt good, when the room was hers.
"In here!"
Marion called toward the entryway.
"David got here early and he's fixing the sink for us."
I heard Ashley's heels on the tile before I saw her. She rounded the corner with 3 of her friends from the real estate office trailing behind her, all of them dressed for the evening already, wine glasses in hand. The kind of easy confidence that comes from a lifetime of rooms opening up for you before you've had to ask. I slid out from under the cabinet enough to look up and smile at her, wrench still in my hand, my forearms streaked with grime. "Hey," I said. "Sorry. I know I'm early. Marion mentioned the leak, figured I'd take a crack at it before dinner." Ashley's eyes moved over me the way they might move over a stranger's dog that had wandered into the yard. A flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed into something else. Behind her, one of her friends, a tall woman named Britt with a wine glass already half empty, tilted her head and asked, not unkindly, just curiously,
"Oh, is that the plumber?"
There was a pause. Not a long one, barely half a second. But I felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky itself has shifted, some current moving through the room that hadn't been there a moment before. Ashley laughed. A light, easy sound. The sound of someone deflecting something she hadn't expected to have to answer in front of an audience. No, she said, waving a hand toward me, toward the sink, toward all of it. "That's David, my fiancé." A small pause. "Well, technically right now that's the help, not family." Her friends laughed. Not cruelly, not even really at me. More the automatic laugh of people following a lead, the way a room laughs when someone confident tells them something is funny. Ashley laughed too, reaching for another glass of wine from the counter, already turning to lead her friends toward the living room. I looked back down at the fitting in my hands. I picked up the wrench, and I kept tightening the pipe. I want to tell you the truth about that moment, because it would be easy to make it sound like something it wasn't. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even exactly hurt. Or not only that. It was something quieter and colder, a kind of clarity settling into my chest the way cold water settles into a low place in the ground, finding its level without any effort at all. I finished tightening the fitting. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me a little, distantly, the way you notice your own steadiness in a moment that should have taken it from you. I turned the water back on at the shutoff valve and watched the line hold, dry, no drip, the way it was supposed to. 26 years of doing this kind of work teaches you that a job is either done right or it isn't, and there's a certain mercy in that. The pipe doesn't care what was just said above it. It only cares whether you did the work. From the living room, I could hear them settling in, the clink of the wine bottle against glass, Britt's voice asking Ashley something about a listing she'd closed that week, Ashley's laugh carrying back to me, unbothered, already 3 rooms away from what she'd just said. I don't think she meant it as cruelty. That was the part that sat strangest in my chest. I don't think, in the moment, she thought of it as anything at all. It had simply come out of her the way water comes out of a cracked pipe, not because the pipe decided to leak, but because somewhere along the way something in the structure had already given, quietly, long before anyone noticed the damage. My father used to say something to me when I was maybe 15, working my first real job at his side. Some homeowner in a big house on the lake who'd looked straight through both of us the entire afternoon like we were part of the plumbing ourselves. I'd been angry about it the whole drive home, and he'd let me be angry for a while before he finally spoke. "Son," he'd said, "eyes on the road, hands loose on the wheel the way they always were. The work doesn't lower you. Never has, never will. But how a person treats you while you're doing it, that'll tell you everything you need to know about who they are when they think it doesn't cost them anything." He'd glanced at me then, just once. Most folks are decent when it's easy to be decent. You want to know somebody's character, watch how they treat the person who can't do a single thing for them in return. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. It came back to me whole, sitting under a stranger's sink with grease under my fingernails and my future mother-in-law's granite counters gleaming above me. And I understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives when you've stopped trying to talk yourself out of something, that I had just been shown exactly what my father meant. Not by a stranger, by the woman I had asked to marry me 6 weeks earlier, in front of her whole family, on one knee, meaning every word of it. I packed my tools back into the steel box, slowly, methodically, the way I always did, because there is a kind of peace in doing a small thing correctly when a large thing has just gone wrong. I wiped down the fitting, checked the shut-off valve twice, wiped the excess water from the cabinet floor with a rag from my back pocket. I did not go find Ashley. I did not say anything to her friends. I stood at that counter for a moment with my hands braced against the granite, head down, and let myself feel the whole weight of it. Not the insult itself, which was small, almost forgettable on its own, but what it revealed. 14 months. A ring already chosen, already sized to her finger, and underneath all of it, apparently, a version of her that had been waiting the entire time for a room that would let it out. I heard footsteps on the tile behind me. Different footsteps this time. Heavier, slower. A man's gait. Uneven in a way that suggested either age or exhaustion or both. I turned, expecting Mr. Whitfield, expecting small talk about the cowboys or the weather, the kind of pleasant nothing that fathers and future sons-in-law exchange to fill the space before dinner. Frank Whitfield stopped in the kitchen doorway. He was still in his coat, keys in hand like he'd just come in from the garage. And when his eyes landed on me, really landed, the way eyes do when recognition arrives all at once instead of gradually, every bit of color went out of his face. "Sir," he said, and his voice had gone thin, almost cracking on the single word. I didn't know you'd be here." For a moment, I didn't understand. I thought perhaps he'd mistaken me for someone else, or that the shock on his face was simply about finding his daughter's fiancé on his knees with a wrench in his kitchen. But there was something else in his eyes, something closer to disbelief than surprise. The particular look of a man who has just watched a ghost walk into his kitchen wearing work boots. "Mr. Whitfield," I said slowly, straightening up, wiping my hands on the rag still in my back pocket. "Good to see you. Everything all right?" He didn't answer right away. He was staring at me the way you might stare at a photograph you'd carried in your wallet for years, finally matched to a face. His keys slipped from his hand and clattered onto the tile, and he didn't even seem to notice. From the living room, Ashley's voice drifted back toward us. "Dad? You home?" Footsteps, unhurried, the sound of someone about to walk back into a room expecting nothing to have changed since she left it. She rounded the corner with a fresh glass of wine in hand and stopped when she saw her father's face. Really stopped. The easy confidence draining out of her posture the way water drains from a tub once the plug's been pulled. "Dad?" she said again, softer this time. "What's wrong?" Frank didn't look at her. He was still looking at me. And slowly, like a man testing whether the ground beneath him would hold, He reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. Worn brown leather, the kind that had clearly been carried in a back pocket for a couple of decades. His hands weren't steady as he opened it. 15 years, he said, more to himself than to anyone in the room. 15 years, I've kept this. He drew out a small card, its edges soft and rounded from handling, the print on it faded, but still legible if you looked closely. He held it out toward me like an offering, or maybe a question he'd been waiting half his life to finally ask out loud. "Is this you?" he said. "Please, tell me if this is you." I didn't need to look closely to know what I'd find printed there. I recognized the card before he'd even fully extended his arm. The plain cream stock, the simple black lettering, the two initials I'd used instead of a full name because at the time, giving my name hadn't seemed like the point. D.C. Nothing else. That and the number for the Garage Bay phone line, disconnected years ago when the company outgrew that first cramped office. No company name, just a man trying to do something decent without turning it into a transaction that required gratitude. "Where did you get that?" I asked, though I already knew. "A man came to my shop," Frank said, and his voice had gone somewhere far away, back to a version of himself 15 years younger and half drowning. 15 years ago. I had a little supply store out on Route 9. Pipe fittings, valves, the kind of place that survives on contractor accounts and not much else. I was 3 weeks from losing everything. My biggest distributor had just dropped me over a paperwork mix-up that wasn't even my fault, and every other supplier in 3 counties wouldn't extend me credit because word had already gotten around that I was going under. He shook his head slowly. I had a wife and a 14-year-old daughter and a mortgage on a building I was about to lose. And I remember standing in that shop after closing, trying to figure out how I was going to tell my family we'd lost everything. Ashley had gone very still beside him. I watched her eyes move from her father's face to the card in his hand, though she was too far away and too confused to read what was printed on it. And then this man walked in. Frank continued. Didn't introduce himself properly. Said he'd heard about my situation from a mutual contact. Said he thought my shop mattered to this town. Said the community needed a supplier who actually knew people's names when they walked in the door. He restructured my whole distributor contract that week. Got me new terms, better than I'd ever had, with a company 3 states over that I'd never even heard of. Years later, that same outfit folded into a bigger one, the one that still fills half my orders today. And when a shipment came in short a few weeks later, short enough to put me right back where I started, he covered the difference himself. Never asked me to pay him back. Never asked for a single thing in return. Frank's eyes were wet now, and he made no move to hide it. He left me this card and said if I ever needed anything, I should call. I called that number for years. It never worked. I never found out who he was. He looked down at the card, then back up at me, and something in his face had gone completely open, unguarded in a way that made him look, for a moment, exactly like the frightened 30-something man he must have been standing in that shop 15 years ago. It's you, isn't it? D.C. David Calloway. You saved my business. You saved my family. The room had gone very quiet. Even Britt and the other 2 friends had drifted into the doorway, sensing something had shifted, wine glasses forgotten in their hands. Ashley looked at her father, then at me, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad," she said, "you know him?" I set the rag down on the counter and let the silence sit there for a moment before I answered, because some silences deserve to be respected rather than filled in a hurry. "I know your husband makes fittings," I said quietly to Frank. "But I never told you it was me. I made a decision a long time ago that the money wasn't the point. If it had a name attached, it would have felt like a transaction. I didn't want you thanking me. I wanted you to keep your shop." Frank's hand was trembling as he held the card, and he pressed his other hand flat against his chest like he was trying to steady something underneath it. 15 years, he said again. My son Michael had a boy 2 years back. I named him David. Didn't tell anyone why, just told my wife it felt right. Did you know that? I never even knew if he were still alive, and I named my own grandson after 2 letters on a business card.
Ashley made a small sound, something between a laugh and a gasp. Disbelief trying to find a shape it could hold on to. "Wait," she said. "Wait, David, you own a supply company? The one Dad's shop runs through?"
Callaway Fabrication, I said. I started it the same year I turned 26, out of a rented garage bay. It's grown some since then. I glanced at Frank. That outfit 3 states over, you remember? That was one of the first partners I brought on when I was still building the company out of that garage. We folded them into Callaway a few years after I helped you. So yes, it was always us. It just didn't have a name worth mentioning yet. I didn't say the rest of it. The annual revenue, the 3 plants, the 400 and change employees who depended on the company doing right by them the way my father had taught me to do right by people. It didn't feel like the moment for numbers. Numbers weren't what mattered here. Frank was still staring at the card in his hand as though it might dissolve if he looked away. "You're the reason my daughter grew up in that house on Maple," he said slowly, and I understood, watching his face, that he wasn't talking to Ashley or to me anymore. Not really. He was talking to himself, working backward through 15 years of a life he'd built on a foundation he'd never fully understood. "You're the reason I could send her to college without loans. You're the reason we never lost the shop, the house, any of it." His eyes came up and found mine, wet and steady now, something settling into place behind them. "And my daughter just called you the help." The words landed in the room the way a dropped glass lands on tile. Not loud exactly, but sharp enough that everyone in the kitchen flinched at once. Britt's face had gone red. The other 2 friends were already inching backward toward the hallway, the particular retreat of people who have realized they are standing in a room where they very much do not want to be standing. Ashley's mouth opened and closed once before any sound came out. Dad, I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? He was under the sink in work clothes. He never said anything about—" "That's not the point, sweetheart." Frank's voice had gone quiet in a different way now. Not soft, but heavy. The voice of a father who has just watched his daughter fail a test he didn't know he'd need her to pass. "You didn't need to know who he was to treat him decently. That was never supposed to be the condition." He looked at her for a long moment, something grieving moving across his features. "Your mother and I raised you better than that. Well, we thought we did." I stood there, watching this unfold, and felt something in my chest that surprised me. Not satisfaction, not vindication, nothing that sharp or that clean. Just a kind of tired sadness settling over the whole room like dust after something has fallen. I hadn't come here to be discovered. I hadn't fixed that sink to prove anything to anyone. I'd fixed it because it was leaking and I knew how to stop it. The same reason I'd done almost everything worth doing in my life. "Ashley," I said, and she turned to me, her eyes bright with tears now. Some mixture of shame and shock and the beginning of something like fear. Fear, I think, of what she'd just lost, though I wasn't sure yet whether she understood the size of it. "This isn't really about the sink, or the card, or even what you said to your friends." I paused, choosing the words carefully. The way you choose your footing on a roof you don't fully trust. "It's about what came out of you when you thought there'd be no cost to it. That's the part that matters. That's always been the part that matters." She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Somewhere behind her, Frank was still holding that faded card in his hand, like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Frank set the card down on the counter, gently, the way you set down something you've protected for a long time and are finally ready to let rest. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He reached out and gripped my shoulder with a hand that was still shaking and held it there.
I've spent 15 years wondering what kind of man does something like that for a stranger and asks for nothing back, he said. I used to imagine all sorts of things. Some retired executive with more money than he knew what to do with. Some quiet philanthropist who did it for a dozen other families too, spreading himself thin across the county like some kind of guardian angel nobody was allowed to see. He shook his head slowly. I never once imagined he'd be sitting across my dinner table, engaged to my daughter, and that she'd have no idea who he was. Ashley had gone very still by the doorway, her wine glass abandoned somewhere on the counter, her arms wrapped around herself in a way that made her look younger than 29, younger than the confident woman who'd walked into this kitchen 20 minutes earlier, trailing laughter behind her like a scarf. "David," she said, and her voice had lost every bit of its earlier ease. "I am so sorry. I don't even know what to say. I was just joking. I didn't mean it the way it—" "You did mean it," I said, not unkindly, but without softening it either, because some things deserve to be said plainly. Maybe not maliciously. Maybe you didn't even think about it long enough to mean it the way it sounded. But that's exactly what worries me, Ashley. You didn't have to think about it at all. It just came out. Easy. Automatic. I looked at her steadily. That tells me something you can't take back just by apologizing for it now. Frank was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke again, softer this time, though there was something in his voice that told me he'd been carrying this particular observation for longer than tonight. "Last spring," he said slowly, looking at his daughter rather than me. "We were at that steakhouse downtown for your mother's birthday. You told the valet he'd parked your car wrong and made him move it twice in the rain because you didn't like where the door landed. Dad." "And at the wedding expo in June," he continued, not raising his voice, just laying the facts out one after another like a man setting tools on a bench. "You made that seating consultant cry because she brought you the wrong shade of ivory swatches. You didn't even apologize. You just moved on to the next vendor." Ashley's face had drained of whatever color remained in it. "That's not. Those are different. Those aren't the same as—" "They're exactly the same," Frank said. And for the first time since he'd walked into the kitchen, his voice carried something like real firmness. "It's the same thing, sweetheart, over and over. It's how you treat people when you've decided they don't matter to your life. And today it just happened to be someone who mattered more than you could possibly have known." He looked around the kitchen, at Britt and the other two friends still hovering awkwardly near the hallway, clearly wishing they were anywhere else, at the card resting on the counter, at me. "I love you. You're my daughter, and I will love you until the day I die, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend I didn't just watch you humiliate the finest man I've ever known, in my own kitchen, over something as small as what he was wearing." The room had gone so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming, the faint drip of water somewhere that had nothing to do with the sink I'd already fixed. Ashley looked at her father, then at me, and something in her face cracked open. Not performance this time. Not the practiced ease she wore so well, but something raw and unguarded. The look of someone finally seeing a mirror held up at an angle she'd never had to face before. "I don't know how to fix this," she said quietly. "I don't know what to say that would make this okay." "I'm not sure you can," I said. And I meant it gently, but I meant it fully. The way you mean something you've already made peace with before you say it out loud. Not tonight, anyway. Maybe not for a long time. This isn't about one bad joke at a bad moment, Ashley. It's about what it revealed. And I can't unknow what I know now. I reached down and closed the latch on my toolbox, the sound of it small and final in the quiet kitchen, and picked it up by the handle. I carried my toolbox to the front hall, and nobody stopped me. Not Ashley, who stood frozen by the kitchen island with her arms still wrapped around herself. Not Britt, or the other two friends who had gone so quiet and so small against the wall that they seemed to be trying to disappear into the paint. Not Frank, who followed a few steps behind me,
close enough that I could hear his breathing, unsteady, working hard to keep pace with everything that had just shifted underneath him. At the door, I set the toolbox down for a moment and turned back. The house looked different to me now than it had 40 minutes earlier. Not the house itself, which hadn't changed at all, but the way I understood what had happened inside it. I thought about how strange it was that a leaking pipe under a sink could open up 15 years of buried history, could reveal, in the space of half an hour, exactly what a marriage would have cost me if I hadn't stopped by early. Frank reached out and took my hand, both of his wrapped around it, the grip of a man trying to say something too large for words. "Whatever happens with you and Ashley," he said, "I need you to know what you did for my family. I need you to hear me say it, out loud, after 15 years of not being able to." His eyes were wet again, unashamed of it now. "You gave us a life. You gave my daughter the childhood that turned her into whoever she's going to decide to become from here. I'm sorry that whoever that is, tonight, wasn't good enough for you. I really am." "You don't owe me an apology, Frank," I said. "You never did. That was never what this was about." I looked past him, to where Ashley still stood in the kitchen doorway, watching us, her face streaked now, mascara run thin down one cheek. She didn't come toward me. I think some part of her understood, the way you understand a verdict before it's formally read, that there wasn't anything left to say that would change what the evening had already decided. "Ashley," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "I loved who I thought you were becoming. I still believe there's a version of you underneath tonight that's better than what came out in that kitchen. But I can't build a marriage hoping I'm right about a version of someone that hasn't shown up yet. I need to be with someone whose decency doesn't depend on knowing who's watching." She didn't argue. She didn't reach for me, didn't ask me to stay, didn't offer the kind of desperate bargaining that so often fills moments like this one. Maybe some part of her, even in the wreckage of the evening, understood that I was right, and that arguing with the truth rarely does anything but delay the moment you have to finally sit with it. I drove home that night with the windows cracked again, same as the drive out, the cold air moving through the cab, carrying away some of the ache that had settled into my chest without my fully noticing when it arrived. I thought about my father, about the wrench still resting in my toolbox on the seat beside me, worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. And I thought about what he used to say, that the trade doesn't care what your bank account looks like, that it fails the same way for everyone, that the measure of a person is what they do when they believe there's nothing in it for them. I thought, too, about Frank, standing in his kitchen with a 15-year-old business card trembling in his hand, a debt he'd carried without a name to attach it to, finally released of the not knowing that had followed him for so long. There was a strange kind of grace in that, even wrapped inside everything else that had happened that night. The idea that a small, quiet kindness, given without any expectation of it ever coming back around, had found its way home again anyway. 15 years later, under a leaking sink, in a kitchen I never expected to walk out of alone. I understand now, more clearly than I did before that evening, that character isn't what shows up when the room is watching. It's what shows up when someone believes no one important is paying attention at all. And I understand, too, that the people who serve you quietly, the plumber, the valet, the seating consultant with the wrong shade of ivory swatches, might be the very ones who once changed your life, or could still change it. If you only looked past what they happened to be wearing that day. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own father, your own quiet kindnesses, or a moment when you were judged by something that didn't tell the whole truth about who you are, I hope you'll take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you the most. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing so we can sit together again for the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some elements of this story are fictionalized for storytelling purposes.